Hello and welcome to my channel. This is going to be another video about charcoal basics. In my previous video I talked about some of the basic materials you need to start working in charcoal, and you don't need to have all of those, but if you do, they will make your job a lot easier and they will help you improve your artwork. Now in this video I want to focus on the basics of drawing a simple outline or a sketch, so basic forms, basic shapes, so that your sketch would resemble whatever it is that you're trying to draw in terms of shape. So in order to do that, first you need to draw your sketch using the proper tools. There are essentially two things you can use. You can use a graphite pencil or you can use charcoal. Now graphite pencils are very convenient sketching tools because they are very light in value and they're easily erased. And you can do your sketch in a graphite pencil, and then you can move on with charcoal and do the rest of the drawing in charcoal. If you don't want to use a graphite pencil, you can use, for example, a charcoal stick like this. This is a vine charcoal stick. So there are a couple of reasons why you may not want to use a graphite pencil for sketching when you're working with charcoal. The first reason is that you're a charcoal purist and you don't want to use anything other than charcoal, and that's fine because I've done a lot of drawings where I use nothing but charcoal, but personally I have nothing against mixed media. In fact, I prefer to combine different types of pencils. But the other reason why some people would avoid using a graphite pencil is because graphite is a lubricant and charcoal needs a little bit of friction for you to draw on paper. So when graphite lubricates that surface, it can be a little bit difficult to draw on top. But as long as you don't use a very soft graphite pencil, and as long as you don't press too hard, you shouldn't have any difficulties drawing over a graphite sketch. Now, like I said, the other thing you can use for sketching is just a regular charcoal pencil, or you can use a vine charcoal stick. These vine charcoal sticks are very good sketching tools because vine charcoal is very soft and it's a little bit lighter in value. It's also easy to manipulate, it's easy to move around, it's easy to erase. So it's perfect for doing a sketch. And that's what I'm going to be using in this video, because this series of videos is all about drawing in charcoal, so I'm going to be using charcoal only. So like I said, vine charcoal is a very useful tool for sketching. It's easily manipulated and it's very easy to modify things and fix some of the mistakes as you go along. Now the question is, now that we know what we're going to do the sketch with, how do we get better at sketching? How do we get better at understanding the shapes we see, and how do we get better at putting them down on the paper? Well, the answer is simple. It's practice. You need to practice, practice, and practice, and you will eventually get better. Now that sounds simple enough, but you're probably wondering, do you have any other more specific tips for beginners? And the answer is, of course, yes. And what you can do is you can try to simplify some of the more complex objects or more complex shapes that you see, and you can try to see them in terms of simpler, basic shapes. So the sketch that I've just done, this elephant, looks pretty complex, and it may not be easy for a beginner to do something like this all at once. But what you can do is you can try to see this in terms of simpler shapes, like, for example, I don't know, circles, rectangles, triangles, and things like that. So maybe we can try to break this down into several simpler shapes. We see maybe a couple of round, maybe elliptical shapes for the body, the head, and the ears, and then we can start adding a few elongated shapes for the trunk and maybe the legs. And at first it won't look great, but remember, this is vine charcoal, so you can always modify these things. You can start changing some of the angles of your lines, you can start refining the shapes, you can start maybe adding some new shapes and adding some details on top of that. And that way your sketch will start to look more like the subject you're trying to draw. Because remember, during this entire process, the artist is always asking himself, what do I see? And how do I interpret it? How do I interpret these shapes? And how do I convey them to the viewer? And to do that, you can sometimes simplify things and try to approximate them to the shapes that you already know and understand. So now let's try to use the same approach when it comes to drawing something a little bit more complex that a lot of artists often struggle with, including myself, and that's a hand. Hands are not easy to draw at all, and it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to understand the shape. But one of the ways you can simplify that process for yourself is to try to see it in terms of basic shapes. So you can simplify the shape of the palm by drawing something like this. Which is kind of like a shape with 5 angles that kind of looks like the shape of the palm without the fingers. And then you can start adding the fingers. You can add the thumb here, and right now you can just add some very simple shapes. So you can add the index finger here and the middle finger here, and of course the size of these fingers in comparison to one another varies from one individual to another, but we're just trying to draw an average looking hand. So now we've managed to draw something that looks like a hand using some very basic shapes. We can also add a wrist here by extending this, and if we want to refine that, we can start erasing some of these lines, like so. Some of these lines which we no longer need. Alright. And then we can start to refine some of these shapes a little bit. So we can refine the appearance of this thumb a little bit, so it's maybe more like this. And the fingers, they have multiple segments, so we can try to define those a little bit better as well, so that we have some joints there. And of course we can make some of these lines a little bit thinner. So now our sketch is starting to look more and more like an actual hand, and then you can start adding some details on top of that, like you can start adding some knuckles and maybe some skin folds here around the joints and some fingernails and things like that. So this now looks like an actual hand. As you can see, we started with some very simple, very basic shapes. Now if you want to turn this open hand into a fist, for example, all you have to do is stick to that basic shape and kind of erase the fingers. So let me try to do that. So you can erase these fingers and you can just draw the knuckles like so, and now you have a fist, and you accomplished all of that using basic shapes, and of course using the fact that you can easily modify your sketch because you're using vine charcoal. Now let's try to move on to something a little bit more complex. So I tried to pick an interesting object to draw, and I picked this one. This is my son's toy. It's kind of a rooster or a chicken that you can wind, and I just want to show you this because this is pretty cool. So when you wind it, it does nothing, but let me show you what happens when I put it down. Alright, so that's pretty awesome, you have to admit. Alright, I'm going to stop it now and we have to move on to the sketch. Alright, so again, I'm using a piece of vine charcoal for the sketch as well. And I'm going to put the reference photo in the top left corner so that you can follow along and so that you can see pretty much the same thing that I'm looking at. So I'm going to start with the head, which is pretty much a circle, or I can simplify it so that it looks like a circle. And the beak, which I'm trying to position here, is almost like a half circle, maybe a little bit elongated, but pretty much a half circle, or at least it looks that way from this angle. And I made it a little bit too big, so I erased it, modified it. So you can see as I'm sketching, I'm also modifying some of the shapes and proportions, because that's easy to do with the vine charcoal. The crest is like 3 triangles, but maybe they're slightly curved, so I'll refine that later. And the body can also be seen like a circle, but it's a slightly larger circle that the head is sitting on top of, and it's kind of pinched at one end, and it extends into this tail. So far I got the basic shape of the body right, and now I can do the legs, which kind of look almost like a couple of cylindrical objects. And we have a vertical one here for the leg, and a little bit of that is also going to be visible on the other side as well. So now that I got the basic outer outline, or the basic shape, I can start adding in some more details. I can start refining that shape. For example, I can separate the beak into the upper and lower portion by adding this space in between, but again, here and there I need to modify a little bit if I see that my sketch deviated from what I see. The thing is that this, like everything else, requires practice, and even though trying to simplify things can be useful, with time and with practice you'll be able to kind of skip that part of the process where you're trying to see things in terms of simpler shapes, and you'll be able to modify things as you go along, and you'll be able to understand things that are more and more complex. So now that I'm adding the eyes here as well, and the pupil, it also has a nice reflection in it here, So I'm gonna draw around it, even though this already falls into the category of shading, I'd say, but I'm just gonna draw it here because it's one of the main details. And this space in between the beak is also darker, and I'm also gonna add the wing, which again is shaped mostly round, but kind of like a teardrop, curved at one end. So now I'm just going to go over some of these lines which I kind of pulled tentatively, and maybe go over them once again and maybe make some tiny adjustments, tiny modifications. And then I can clean up the edges a little bit and erase some of the excess charcoal and fix some of the mistakes, clean up my sketch a little bit. I can either leave it like that, or I can prepare it for the next stage, which would be the shading, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next video. So now I'm just going to make some of these lines a little bit cleaner and smoother. And that's it. That's the finished sketch. As you can see, it looks pretty close to my reference. And we did all that by using some simple shapes to construct a more complex, larger shape. So once again, if you want me to take you through the process, we have a smaller circle sitting on top of a larger one, which kind of extends into this tail, and the beak is a half circle, and then we have these triangles for the crest, which I later refined a little bit, and then I simply added some details on top, and it's simple enough. So here are both of the finished sketches, and as you can see, even though the form looks realistic, this is still a bunch of lines, and we'll need to learn how to go from this to this, and in order to do that I'll have to talk about shading, and I'm going to do that in the next video. So until then, thank you for watching, and bye.